Today is July 28th, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine has reached a critical juncture where even the commanding officer of Ukrainian forces admits that Ukraine is outnumbered, outgunned, and is being outfought. His inability to formulate a coherent strategy beyond empty rhetoric signals that even the top leadership of Ukraine's military realizes the conflict is lost. It's just a matter of how and when this will all end. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the upcoming US presidential election and how it literally does not matter who is elected into office. The same singular US foreign policy being driven forward by unelected corporate financier interests will continue no matter who is in office, and how even the candidates themselves are telling you that they are not going to change anything at all. I will get into all of that. First, let's start with the map, the live map of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. This comes from liveuamap.com. It's a pro-Ukrainian map, and I use a pro-Ukrainian map because of even an extremely pro-Ukrainian map, which delays showing Russian gains for sometimes days or even weeks. If they are showing you how dire the situation is, it's very difficult to argue otherwise. Let's take a look at the map. So the territory in red here is held by Russia. The line of contact stretches from Kherson all the way up to Kupiansk in Kharkov. There's also a new front in Kharkov, north of the city of Kharkov. If we zoom in and we use the timeline just from July 1st to July 27th, you can see the gains. These are not incredible gains, they're incremental gains. Considering that this is a war of attrition and Russia's primary objective is to wear down Ukrainian forces, to wear them down to the point where they begin to crumble and collapse along the line of contact, this is a sign that the strategy is working. Let's continue looking along critical areas along the line of contact. Now this is Orekhov. This was the salient that Ukraine created during its failed, defeated 2023 offensive. This was the extent of it. This was meant to reach the Sea of Azov. You can see how far short they fell of that objective. There's also Vuhledar here in the southern Donetsk region. If we look at July 1st and we look at July 27th, we can see how Russian forces are hooking around Vuhledar. And this is to cut Vuhledar off from other main roads across the rest of the Donbas region. Eventually they will encircle and they will take Vuhledar. And so this is about taking these last major fortified cities, towns along the line of contact and pushing Ukrainian forces into territory that they don't really have strong defenses prepared in. Continuing outside of Donetsk city, right here, we remember all the way back in January, Avdiivka was the front line. Ukrainian forces held this fortress city that they had maintained since 2014. Russian forces are all the way here, even from July 1st to July 27th, we can see the progress that they are making, and it's along multiple salients directly west of Donetsk and to the northwest of Donetsk. If we continue up, New York, it is a town, city, a small city town in eastern Ukraine, also called New York. And we can see how Russia has made progress. Again, according to this very pro-Ukrainian map. Here is Bakhmut. July 1st, Russian forces were outside Chasiv Yar, this area right here, west of Bakhmut. As of July 27th, they have made it inside Chasiv Yar. And we see this canal here, the Syrsky Donetsk Donbas Canal. They are east of it. They're also now west of it. And this is part of taking all of Chasiv Yar. And you can see how Russian forces are hooking around the north. So again, July 1st to July 27th. Again, you will hear Ukrainian and across the collective West, political leaders, military leaders, commentators, analysts, all talking about how slow Russian progress is. But this is not maneuver warfare. This is a war of attrition. And the fact that Ukrainian forces are crumbling all along the line of contact indicates that the war of attrition is working in Russia's favor, and it continues. If we go up to Kupiansk in Kharkov, we can see Russian forces from July 1st to July 27th making progress in that direction. And of course, this pro-Ukrainian map shows no progress in this northern front that Russia has opened north of Kharkov city. You can see there's really no change at all between July 1st and July 27th. Ukraine mobilized its already overstretched forces. They sent them to Kharkov to stop Russian forces from advancing along this front. But because they did this, they weakened the line of contact everywhere else, affording Russia these advances. And we remember the New York Times article, this one, facing Russian advance, a top Ukrainian general paints a bleak picture. They're talking about General Budanov, head of Ukrainian military intelligence, May 14th, 2024. This is what the article says. The situation is on the edge, General Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, said in a video call from a bunker in Kharkov. Like most Ukrainian officials and military experts, General Budanov said he believes the Russian attacks in the northeast are intended to stretch Ukraine's already thin reserves of soldiers and divert them from fighting elsewhere, which they clearly did, and it has worked. That is exactly what is happening now, he acknowledged. He said the Ukrainian army was trying to redirect troops from other frontline areas to shore up its defenses in the northeast, but that has been difficult. It's been difficult to find the personnel. All of our forces are either here in Kharkov or in Chasiv Yar, which I showed you Russian forces are making progress there, referring to a Ukrainian stronghold about 120 miles farther south that Russian troops have assaulted in recent weeks. I've used everything we have. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone else in the reserves. This speaks to the dire circumstances Ukraine's military is operating under. It gets worse. That was back in May. This is a much more recent article. Others have covered this. This was in The Guardian. They're interviewing General Syrsky, the commanding officer of Ukraine's armed forces. I know we will win, and how? Ukraine's top general on turning the tables against Russia. Nowhere in this article is any coherent, specific strategy articulated about how Ukraine will win, how they will turn the tables on Russia. As a matter of fact, everything General Syrsky tells The Guardian indicates Ukraine is decisively losing and is irreversibly losing. So I'm going to read from this article, and then we will get into the presidential elections following this. Just want to make it clear that even the commanding officer of Ukraine's armed forces admits that the war is all but lost. Syrsky is Ukraine's new commander-in-chief. His unenviable task is to defeat a bigger Russian army. 2.5 years into Vladimir Putin's full-scale onslaught, he acknowledges the Russians are much better resourced. They have more of everything: tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, soldiers. Their original 100,000 strong invasion force has grown to 520,000, he said, with a goal by the end of 2024 of 690,000 men. So it was a full-scale invasion in 2022. Sounds like it's a much fuller scale invasion now. The figures for Ukraine have not been made public, and obviously if the figures were favorable for Ukraine, they would be made public, but because it would undermine public support and morale and that of the troops on the line of contact, it is being kept secret. But it's not hard to look at the battlefield and infer what those numbers are, more or less. When it comes to equipment, there is a ratio of 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 in their favor, he said. Since 2022, the number of Russian tanks has doubled from 1,700 to 3,500. This contradicts all of these verified, fraudulent, fake, so-called open source intelligence projects claiming to tally Russian losses. According to their tallies, Russia has run out of tanks, artillery, armored vehicles 10 times over. Clearly, those projects were simply war propaganda dressed up as some sort of open source intelligence project. So tanks have doubled, artillery systems have tripled, and armored personnel carriers have gone from 4,500 to 8,900. The enemy has a significant advantage in force and resources, Syrsky said. Therefore, for us, the issue of supply, the issue of quality is really at the forefront. Now, if you have been following my updates over the last 2+ years, or that of Alex Christoforou, Alexander Mikuris of the Duran, or Mark Sloboda, or Scott from Calibrated, whose channels I've included in the video description below. They give daily updates on everything that is taking place in Ukraine. If you have been following our analysis, none of this would be news to you. This was something that the Western media itself, albeit buried deep within their articles, have been admitting all along. It was obvious from the very beginning, and it was a reality that the collective West tried deliberately to paper over. That the goal was to maintain public support for Ukraine and to encourage Ukrainians to fight on, despite the futility of doing so. And I want to remind people that all the way back in 2019, there was this policy paper by the Rand Corporation, funded by the largest corporate financier interest in the collective West, as well as the US government itself, extending Russia competing from advantageous ground. And if you look at this report, you can download it for free. The link will be in the video description. And you can see there were a number of measures, economic measures, geopolitical measures, including measure number 1, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. The whole point of this was to provoke Russia into intervening in Ukraine. A large-scale armed intervention in Ukraine meant to bleed Russia dry, and knowingly at the entire expense of Ukraine. And this is what the report said, and I've gone over this many times before. It's important to continue doing this, how premeditated all of this was, and how it transcended multiple US presidential administrations, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and soon whoever wins the election this year. Regardless of who wins, it will continue. Under measure 1, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. If we go down, they break it into benefits and risks. And so under benefits, it says expanding US assistance to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, would likely increase the cost to Russia in both blood and treasure of holding the Donbas region. More Russian aid to the separatists and an additional Russian troop presence would likely be required, leading to larger expenditures, equipment losses, and Russian casualties. The latter could become quite controversial at home, as it did when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And the implications here is that Russia would overextend itself between this and all of the other measures they prescribed to extend Russia. The idea was to precipitate a Soviet-style collapse, to overextend and collapse Russia by encircling it and containing it with chaos, proxy wars, political instability. Under risks, it admits that this process is almost certainly going to, if it unfolds, it will almost certainly be entirely to Ukraine's detriment. There will be no victory for Ukraine. Such a move might also come at significant cost to Ukraine and to US prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, which is now admittedly so, territorial losses indisputably having happened and continues to happen, and refugee flows. All of this has come to pass. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace, which is a certainty at this point. The only question is how disadvantageous. It depends on how long Ukraine allows the US to compel it to fight forward before accepting Russian terms. So the whole point of the proxy war against Russia wasn't for Ukraine to win, it was to just overextend and bleed Russia dry. That was the whole point of all of this. The reality of Russia outnumbering, outgunning, and outfighting Ukraine, that was evident from the very beginning, and I have been pointing it out from the beginning. Others have been pointing it out from the very beginning. The entire point of lying to the public, trying to convince them that Ukraine had some sort of chance for victory, was to convince Ukrainians to fight to the last Ukrainian, to completely destroy Ukraine in this process of fighting Russia in this proxy war. That's the whole point of a proxy war. Your proxy suffers the consequences of the war and you reap the benefits. So let's get back to the Guardian piece, this interview with General Syrsky. It says, "It is this man and machine superiority that explains recent events on the battlefield. Since last autumn, Ukraine's armed forces have been going steadily backwards. One of his first acts when he got the job in February 2024, replacing Zaluzhny, now Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, failing upwards, was to order the withdrawal of his troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka. The retreat coincided with a 6-month gap in the U.S. supply of weapons. More have recently arrived. The Russians, however, are still seizing fields and villages in the eastern Donbass, using airdrop bombs to blast a path forward. They have gobbled up territory northwest of Avdiivka toward the garrison town of Pokrovsk and besieged the hilltop settlement of Chasov Yar. In May, Russian forces opened a new front in the Kharkov region, storming the city of Volchansk. Ukraine anticipated this attack. Seemingly, it couldn't stop it. And I showed you all of this on the pro-Ukrainian liveuamap.com. It also says Syrsky sought to put recent setbacks in context. Of course, he has to do this. He described Russia's creeping victories as tactical ones, local gains, rather than an operational breakthrough, such as the capture of a major city, although Russia is capturing entire cities. They're small, they're not major cities, but they're cities nonetheless. In principle, the enemy has not made any significant progress, he said. The front line, he added, was 3,700 kilometers long. Active hostilities are taking place across 977 kilometers of it, or twice the length of the border between Germany and France. And I don't know what his point of saying this is. It seems to only add more gravity to this reality of Russia outnumbering, outgunning Ukraine, and how much its depleted forces are stretched to try to maintain this line of contact. Now, if Russia was using NATO-style maneuver warfare, which is to rush into a targeted country, overwhelm defending forces, seize as much territory as possible, to topple the government as quickly as possible, then this outcome would be an abject failure for Russia. But that is not what Russia is doing. They attempted to do that in the opening phase in 2022, and it didn't work. They had prepared for years for a long-term, intense, protracted conflict. They had built their military-industrial base up to facilitate that. That is something that took years of planning. They knew it was going to be a difficult war. They had hoped that they could end it quickly, but they were well prepared for it to drag on. And so that is where we are right now. It is a war of attrition. They are grinding Ukrainian forces down. The fact that they are in reverse all along the line of contact indicates that the war of attrition Russia is waging is succeeding. Let's continue with this article, the Guardian article. Amid skepticism about Ukraine's prospects of achieving outright victory, Syrsky noted various positive developments, and this is just a way of coping with the reality that Ukraine is losing. None of the things he talks about has any chance at all of changing the outcome of this conflict strategically. F-16s would strengthen Ukraine's air defenses. They would allow Kiev to work more effectively against Russian cruise missiles and to hit ground targets accurately. However, there were limits to what F-16s might achieve, he stressed. So even Syrsky, General Syrsky himself is tempering the expectations surrounding the F-16s. They had to remain 40 kilometers or more from the front line because of the risk Moscow would shoot them down. And Russia has the means of destroying these aircraft no matter where on the ground they are stationed, no matter how close or far from the line of contact they are. They have the ability to strike and destroy them. It also says Russia had superior aviation and very strong air defenses. Again, this is General Syrsky admitting all of this. Because of this, Ukraine has increasingly turned to unmanned aerial systems, Syrsky said. It used drones very effectively and was trying out robotic ground systems, land robots that could deliver ammunition or rescue a wounded soldier. There was a new unmanned systems command, the first of its kind. We fight not by quantity but quality, he said, adding that drones played as big a role as artillery. But this is a myth. This is a myth that has been thoroughly busted throughout the duration of the special military operation in Ukraine. Not only does Russia have more of everything, their weapons are comparable or even superior to Western weapons. We've seen a lot of these superior Western precision-guided munitions simply fail to work on the battlefield because of superior Russian electronic warfare capabilities. Just one example. And the fact is, Russia has more drones than Ukraine, and drones comparable to the capabilities of Ukrainian drones and some Russian drones that Ukraine has no equivalent of, and certainly not in the quantities Russia possesses. Then The Guardian cites another myth. It says Ukraine's armed forces were successfully using long-range kamikaze drones to strike deep inside Russia. Again, this is General Syrsky telling The Guardian this. So far, they had targeted about 200 critical infrastructure sites. All were connected with military logistics and included factories, fuel dumps, and munition depots. Yet, the beginning of this article describing how vastly Russian forces outnumber, outgun, and are outfighting Ukraine suggests that this drone campaign deep inside Russian territory, beyond the symbolic propaganda value that it has made no strategic difference at all. Russia is still easily outpacing, outproducing, not just Ukraine, but the collective West. And just as all other Ukrainian and collective West politicians, military leaders, commentators, analysts, as they all do when searching desperately for some metric of Ukrainian success in this conflict, they talk about the Black Sea. So speedboat-like sea drones, meanwhile, had sunk about a third of Russia's Black Sea naval fleet. It really became a trap for them and for some vessels, a grave, Syrsky said. The Kremlin, he added, has been forced to completely pull out from the Crimean port of Sevastopol after a series of Ukrainian attacks. But this is primarily a land war. Land war, General Syrsky admits Ukraine is losing, without doubt losing, irreversibly losing. What did they achieve by driving the Black Sea fleet further east? The only role the Black Sea fleet was playing in this conflict primarily was to launch cruise missiles. Their range is such that it doesn't matter where they are in the Black Sea, no matter how far east they go in the Black Sea, they can still hit virtually any target anywhere inside Ukraine. So what did they achieve? Again, besides propaganda value, what did they achieve with this? And has that success in the Black Sea translated to success on the battlefield? Here's General Syrsky telling you no, it hasn't. It hasn't translated into victory on the actual battlefield. This war is primarily being fought on. Then he begins to talk about Crimea. Drone and missile strikes have wiped out radar and rocket installations. A key Ukrainian objective is to destroy the Kerch road and rail crossing connecting the occupied peninsula with Russia. Syrsky declined to say when this might happen. Two earlier attempts featured a truck bomb and a drone strike. He said Kiev had a plan to get Crimea, back Crimea, more than a decade after Vladimir Putin illegally annexed it. Well, there was a referendum. The people in Crimea, who even US government polling discovered identify as Russian, they voted to rejoin with the rest of Russia, Crimea having historically been part of Russia throughout history. Was this really feasible? So this plan of taking back Crimea, was this really feasible? It's realistic. This is Syrsky saying, it's realistic. Of course, it's a big military secret, the general said. He continued, we will do everything we can to reach the internationally recognized borders of 1991 when Ukraine voted for independence from the USSR. We have to win to liberate our citizens who are in the occupied territories, who are suffering. And so this is just meaningless, empty platitudes in place of where a coherent military strategy should go. If there was actually a way for Ukraine to turn the tables on Russia, as the headline of this Guardian article suggests, he would have said something about it somewhere in this article. There's no There's no plan, secret or otherwise, that can turn the tables when everything is so decisively in Russia's favor, as General Syrsky himself admits. Now, this idea of blowing up the Kerch Bridge or the Crimean Bridge, I've explained this many times. Crimea rejoined Russia in 2014. The bridge was completed in 2018. The land bridge was established in 2022. So for several years, Russia was able to maintain logistical support of the Crimean Peninsula using just seaports. It has several major seaports that can move millions of tons of supplies. It includes ports for ferries that move people and vehicles back and forth to the rest of Russia. There's also a land bridge. Ukraine has no means whatsoever at this point to cut. So you blow up the bridge, the physical bridge. Russia still has seaports, multiple seaports, and a land bridge that can easily supply Crimea with absolutely everything it needs. Now, this quote from General Syrsky about a plan to get all of Crimea back, this entire peninsula, far behind the line of contact, he's saying this even as he admits Ukrainian forces cannot hold small towns, small cities along the line of contact. They can't even hold on to towns and cities along the line of contact, but he's claiming Ukraine has some sort of plan to retake an entire peninsula. Just completely irrational, fantastical, unrealistic, pure propaganda for whoever is willing to believe it, but propaganda nonetheless. And even as he's admitting, General Syrsky admits that Russia outnumbers and is outfighting Ukraine. They talk about Ukraine's own struggle to raise manpower. There's a manpower crisis in Ukraine. One of Syrsky's most pressing challenges is to find new recruits to replace Ukrainian soldiers who have been killed and injured. Those fighting in trenches are exhausted. The patriotic fervor that led many in spring 2022 to volunteer has worn off, and the propaganda that convinced Ukrainians that somehow they could win, that is all worn off. They can see reality now. They can see how futile this is. The government recently reduced the conscription age from 27 to 25. Last week, a new law came into effect requiring men to register their details with military recruitment centers. Many have done so, others are hiding. I've exhaustively talked about the problem of training these new conscripts. Russia is eliminating Ukrainian manpower faster than it can be reconstituted, faster than Ukrainians can properly train conscripts and send them to the line of contact. So what's happening instead is they're rushing through the training and they're reaching the line of contact being entirely ineffective. They are ineffective as combat soldiers. And what this creates is a vicious cycle. The more unprepared soldiers you send to the line of contact, the faster they will be eliminated, the more you're going to have to rush through training and send to the line of contact. There is no way to break this cycle at this point. It continues. It says, Syrsky said that without mobilization, he could not create new reserves and brigades. So they need entire new brigades, which are needed as Russia multiplies its own land forces. It's very important for us that all citizens of Ukraine fulfill their constitutional duty, he said. He urged Ukrainians living outside the country to take part as well. I hope that after victory, they will be able to tell their children where they were. Where were you when all citizens of Ukraine were fighting in such fierce battles? That is the question. One initiative is taking shape in neighboring Poland. Ukrainians abroad will soon be invited to join a new legion there. So there's a legion, they're talking about a brigade, basically. Training will take place in Poland itself, building trust between men and officers. Later, the legion will transfer to the front line. Good luck with that. I've already talked about how to build a new brigade, an entirely new brigade. You need 2 to 3 years. They're going to rush this through in probably months, if not weeks, and they're going to send them to Ukraine to almost certain death on the line of contact. And this is how the article ends. Russia began its armed takeover of Ukraine in 2014 when it covertly grabbed parts of the Donetsk region. More than a decade on, there seems little likelihood Europe's biggest war since 1945 will finish this year or next. Donald Trump's pledge to end the war in one day notwithstanding. Could Ukraine win? And if so, how long before victory? I think, and so now they're quoting General Syrsky, I think you have to be very, very brave to say when. We do everything to make it happen. There is simply no more important task for us, Syrsky said, leaving the stage and striding back to work. Well, unfortunately for General Syrsky and the rest of Ukraine, those sort of platitudes do not win wars. Sufficient manpower, equipment, weapons, and ammunition do. And Ukraine has none of these things. And the West is incapable of providing them these things. So they lose the war. It's just a matter of exactly when, and exactly how. So this is where we are. We are here. This 2019 Rand Corporation paper, extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground. They are exercising the provide lethal aid to Ukraine. They talk about how it's going to draw Russia into an armed conflict. And now we are at the end game, where such a move might come at significant cost to Ukraine. It could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace. So we're at the end game described by Rand Corporation in 2019. This was the plan, to use Ukraine to draw Russia into a costly conflict. Eventually, at some point, either Russia would collapse or Ukraine would be destroyed. So we're watching Ukraine be destroyed. That's where we are. Now, people are wondering, when is it going to end? How is it going to end? They're talking about the possibility of this ending, say, within a year. Others are saying years. It could be years more of fighting. I cannot say when, because it depends on many factors that are changing. If Russia is continuing militarily to take territory incrementally as it is and grinding down Ukrainian forces, it all depends on how long Ukrainian forces can continue operating along the line of contact before fighting capacity collapses entirely. And then the territory will fall much faster. And it's changing because influx of support changes, where Ukraine commits its forces changes, how much Russia has along the line of contact, how much it's preparing, that is constantly changing. For the most part, it's constantly expanding. So you have to take all of these changing variables into account when thinking about when it could possibly end. Many people are pinning their hopes on the US presidential election this year, 2024. Former US President Donald Trump, and his vice president pick, J.D. Vance, if you're not listening to them carefully, it almost sounds like they're saying they want peace in Ukraine. They want peace in Ukraine, and they want to focus on America first. As a matter of fact, we have this article from Foreign Policy. Trump's VP pick goes America first on foreign policy, but is it America first? Is somehow the United States helping Ukraine, helping Europe with this conflict in Ukraine? Or is this conflict in Ukraine wholly created by the US itself in the first place, coercing Europe to contribute to this proxy war? And of course, Ukraine itself having been fully pushed by the US into this proxy war, starting at least as early as 2014, when the US overthrew the elected government of Ukraine and installed a client regime hostile to Russia in its place. If you listen to J.D. Vance carefully, he's not talking about ending the conflict in Ukraine. He's talking about reducing US support for Ukraine. He wants Europe to pick up the slack. And the reason why he wants to do this is because he wants the US to focus entirely on provoking war with China. And if you think carefully about all of this, it is simply a continuation of one singular policy that has been moving forward regardless of who is in power in Congress and regardless of who is sitting in the White House. Now, real quick, I want to go back to this Rand Corporation paper, providing lethal aid to Ukraine. Under which administration did that begin? It began under the Trump administration. And it wasn't because President Obama refused to do it. It simply wasn't time yet to do it. This was a step-by-step process. Providing lethal aid was inevitable. It didn't matter who was in the White House. When it was time to do it, it would be done. It just so happened that President Trump was in office. And so here's from ABC News. This was 2019. Trump admin approves new sale of anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. And this is following previous approval in 2017. Trump administration has approved the $39 million sale of defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine. So lethal aid right there. The new package will include Javelin anti-tank weapons, with one U.S. official saying it includes 150 missiles and 2 launchers. This followed a $400 million military assistance package for maritime security, special operations units, secure communications, and light weapons like sniper rifles and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. And it points out that the Trump administration first approved the sale of Javelins to Ukraine in December 2017, a step that former President Barack Obama never took, and that Trump allies have pointed to as a sign of Trump's toughness on Russia. And again, this is the WWE professional wrestling style narratives that US politics uses to convince American people that there is some sort of debate taking place, and that this is not just simply continuity of agenda. But I assure you, it is continuity of agenda. If it was Hillary Clinton in office instead of former President Donald Trump, then she would have done this also at this time. This was the time to do it. They were trying to provoke Russia into being drawn into Ukraine and overextending itself. That was what this was all about. Now, former President Trump sending actual weapons to Ukraine, this was almost certainly the red line that convinced Russia of the necessity to launch a special military operation, which eventually would be launched in 2022 during the Biden administration. We have to remember that this wasn't the first time the US did this. They overthrew the Georgian government in 2003. They began building it up militarily. And in 2008, according to the EU's own investigation, Georgian forces attacked Russian forces, precipitating the Georgian-Russian War of 2008, which Georgia decisively lost. So what was going on in Ukraine from 2014 all the way up until the Russian intervention in 2022 was the same process, but just on a much larger, and for Russia, a much more dangerous, unacceptable scale. They could not just allow the much larger Ukraine be pumped full of NATO weapons, NATO bases, because they would have this threat directly on their border on a much larger scale. We already saw how precarious Russia's situation was during the Russian-Georgian war in 2008. You can only imagine if Russia waited for Ukraine to be full of weapons, NATO-trained forces, before they went and attacked again. We have to remember the 2019 paper in black and white explaining how the US would really leave Russia no choice but to intervene in Ukraine or face a giant militarized regime hostile to Russia, almost certain to attack it in the near future. Now, for a lot of people, the history of this conflict in Ukraine begins in 2014 with the overthrow of the Ukrainian government by the US. For some people, it starts in 2022 when Russia intervened in Ukraine. But I would say it goes even further back than that. And I've gone over this article many, many times before. This is from all the way back in 2004. US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. So the US was trying to overthrow the Ukrainian government all the way back during the Bush administration. And it says the campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated, brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. Well, it's the US interfering in the internal political affairs of other nations in violation of international law, removing governments they don't like and installing client regimes obedient to Washington and willing to advance US foreign policy objectives, even at the cost of their own nation and their own people. And down here it says, funded and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, the 2 big American parties. So both parties are in on it, not just the Democrats, not just the Republicans, both of them. US non-government organizations, they're referring to the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID organizations like that, Freedom House even. And they admit that it was used in 2000, so this was during the Clinton administration, to overthrow the government in Serbia. They admit that it was done in Georgia. That was 2003. And they tried to do it in Belarus. They also admit that all the way in Latin America, they were doing it in Nicaragua. So this has been going on for a very, very long time. A lot of people have this misconception that US foreign policy is a lot like two drivers in a car fighting over the steering wheel. And when the Republicans get the steering wheel, they drive in one direction. And when the Democrats get the steering wheel, they turn it and they go in a completely different direction, maybe even a U-turn, some people might imagine. But in reality, it is a much more accurate analogy to compare this to a single person using their left and their right legs to climb a set of stairs. So let's just look at this. I'm titling this Continuity of Agenda, the Encirclement of Russia from 1993 to 2024. And of course, we could go all the way back to the end of World War II with this, but let's just stick with 1993 to 2024. So under Bill Clinton, as per that Guardian article, they overthrew the Serbian government in 2000. This was also when NATO bombed and divided and destroyed Yugoslavia. And this was all part of encircling and containing Russia, eliminating nations that were friendly to Russia, replacing them with hostile client regimes. Under the administration of, so that was 1993 to 2001, under George Bush Jr., 2001 to 2009, the attempted overthrow of Ukraine and Belarus, the successful overthrow of Georgia in 2003, and then the 2008 Georgian attack on Russian forces. Now we have the Obama administration from 2009 to 2017. This is when they finally successfully overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014. They installed a regime hostile to Russia, and they aided and abetted Ukraine in violating the Minsk agreements. Then you had President Donald Trump himself. He provided lethal aid to Ukraine, creating a 2003-2008 Georgia scenario. So they were recreating this. But he could not have done this if all of these other presidents before him didn't climb the stairs up to that step. And of course, after Donald Trump, we have Joe Biden, 2021 to 2024, and he is now finally presiding over this proxy war that all of these previous steps were walking up to. That was the top step, is to trigger this proxy war and hopefully overextend and collapse Russia. That is the whole point of that. And I could do a diagram exactly like this, but in relation to the Middle East, Iran, more specifically. I could also do a diagram exactly like this, depicting the continuity of agenda of US foreign policy toward China. And again, that goes all the way back to World War II, actually before World War I, as a matter of fact. If a US president is not in charge of US foreign policy, if the people in Congress are not in charge of US foreign policy, who is? Who's in charge? All you have to do is look up information about who is funding and chairing these think tanks. This is Campaign for Rand. So who's running the Rand Corporation? Who is giving money to the Rand Corporation? Now, if you look at the board of trustees, you can see it's all people going through the revolving door of corporate financier power and the US government. They also work in academia, and a lot of them come from some of the largest, most powerful corporate financier interests in the collective West. Here is a list of supporters for this campaign. So if you look through all of these lists, you're going to see a lot of names. I'm just going to read you some of the ones you'd probably be most familiar with. So there's Marcia and Frank Carlucci Charitable Foundation. Well, Frank Carlucci was of the private equity firm Carlyle, the Carlyle Group. So a private equity firm, people who have shares in the largest, most powerful corporations on earth in the collective West. There's also State Farm Insurance, Allstate Insurance Company, Alcoa Foundation. This is part of the aluminum industry. American International Group, or AIG Insurance, Dow Chemical Company, General Electric, General Motors, ExxonMobil Corporation, and Pfizer. But this is not an exhaustive list of the special interests driving US foreign policy. The Rand Corporation is just one of many, many think tanks. Corporations, often the same corporations, are funding. There's an ecosystem of policy think tanks these corporations fund. And what happens is These think tanks serve as a forum to arrive at consensus between all these corporate financier interests. They write up policy papers. Policy papers are taken by lawyers and turned into bills. The bills are taken to Washington by lobbyists to be rubber stamped by Congress and signed off by whoever's in the White House, regardless of whoever's in the White House. And then the corporate media sells this policy to the American people. That is how it really works. So you cannot vote these people out of public office because they operate above public office, and everyone in public office works for them, not you or I. So how can we go about changing this? If we can't vote our way out of this at the ballot box, how do we actually change this? What do we do about this? Think about multipolarism and why multipolarism is on the rise and why the collective West's primacy over the globe is in irreversible decline. Because multipolarism is all about countries around the world creating their own alternatives to all of these corporate financier monopolies. They're creating their own payment systems, their own financial institutes, their own alternatives for all these large corporations, whether they're in industry or services. They've created these alternatives and people around the world are paying into these alternatives. That is how power is shifting. That is why there is a growing balance of power around the globe. The entire world isn't just paying into Wall Street, Washington, London, and Brussels. They're now able to spread their money, their time, their attention, and their energy across a wide variety of alternatives. And inside of America, people must do this also. They must find local alternatives, create local alternatives, pay their money, time, attention into those instead of these corporations that, again, are driving U.S. foreign policy, U.S. domestic policy, regardless of who you vote into office. So I hope that makes it clear. I hope that clears it up. The situation in Ukraine is only going to change if Russia and the rest of the multipolar world continue working to do so. Inside the United States, unless you change this formula of who holds all of the power, it's not going to change on its own. No matter who you vote into office this year, they're going to continue forward with this singular agenda that has transcended decades, multiple presidential administrations, and regardless of who is in Congress. The only reason the US is going to abandon Ukraine is just like the only reason they abandoned Afghanistan. They needed to refocus on the coming proxy war in Ukraine. And if they're going to abandon Ukraine, it's so that they can pivot toward a much larger, more dangerous war with China. And that is basically what both Trump and J.D. Vance are promising voters. Voters aren't hearing it because they only want to hear what they want to hear. They're allowing their own hope, and it's well-intentioned hope. It's well-intentioned hope. These are well-meaning people. They want to see change, but they're allowing their emotions, hope being an emotion, they're allowing that to blind them to what is really being said and what is inevitably going to happen regardless of who gets into office. So in the meantime, I will keep an eye on all of this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm putting these videos not only on YouTube, but a backup on Telegram. I'm also uploading videos on Rumble. The links to that will all be in the video description below. In the video description below are all the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no additional resources and you're just helping share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That all helps make this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.